Hello, and welcome to today's learning session, Jurisdictional Approaches to Zero-Deforestation Commodities, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am a Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. Our presenter today is Michael Wolosin of Forest Climate Analytics. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. If you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat area, and we'll try to get you sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We will answer as many as possible during our allotted time, and after the webinar you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. Thank you again for joining us, and with that we'll get started. Lloyd Gamble, also of WWF Forest and Climate, is going to start us off, so Lloyd, take us away.
Thanks, Emmeline, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for WWF's Forest and Climate webinar series and our presentation today on jurisdictional approaches to achieving zero deforestation commodities. I'm Lloyd Gamble, Director of Forests and Climate for WWF US. I've worked over the last 5 years or so on REDD+ as part of WWF's Global Forest and Climate team, and particularly on multilateral public finance supporting REDD+ activities in forest countries under funds like the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the Green Climate Fund. Most recently, I'm involved in an initiative here at WWF exploring how we can achieve stronger complementarities between our work on deforestation and governance and our work in the private sector, where we help companies to develop and implement sustainability commitments around major food commodities, as well as timber, pulp, and paper. Along these lines, there's been increasing buzz in the last year or two about these so-called jurisdictional approaches, production protection compacts, jurisdictional certification, things along these lines, but not very accessible information on the substance of these approaches and how far progressed they are on a spectrum from concept or idea to actual implementation. So we partnered with Michael Wolosin at Forest Climate Analytics to dig into this, to essentially assess the state of play in jurisdictional approaches to de-free production, and to describe what differentiates the various approaches being piloted. This culminated in a paper that we released just before the UNFCCC Marrakesh meetings, and is largely the basis for today's discussion. Links to this paper can be found on our website, and will be also in the follow-up note to webinar participants. So Michael has been embedded in the forest and climate space for many years, most recently with Climate Advisors here in Washington, D.C., where he played an important role paving the way to the New York Declaration on Forests, and where he continues to serve as a senior fellow. He's also a visiting scholar at Resources for the Future. Michael's known for his great analytical work on climate finance and U.S. climate policy and tropical forest conservation, among other things. So with that, I'll pass it over to him to talk a bit more about this work. Mike, to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lloyd, and thank you for everyone joining us today. And I especially appreciate the opportunity to work with WWF to do some really interesting research on jurisdictional approaches. So I wanted to put up this splash quote first, because as Lloyd mentioned in his introduction, there really has been an explosion of interest in jurisdictional approaches in the last 2 years or so. The explosion has been driven by a few things we'll talk about in a moment, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about methodology for the research. So when WWF brought me in March of 2016, we talked about how best to take the pulse of this community and decided that an interview methodology was really what was needed, given that so many of the programs and emerging strategies are new enough that there isn't a lot of information out on the web on specific programs. So we did a combination of desk research, looking around, seeing who was doing what, and also about 30 interviews with leading stakeholders and members of both the private sector, the NGOs, as well as a few representatives of governments and recent government representatives, to try to understand why they are looking to jurisdictional approaches, what some of the leading approaches are, what some of the opportunities are, and really where the space might be going. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the emergence of these jurisdictional approaches, and I really wanted to step back from just asking what was out there to asking what it emerged from, why people are looking to these strategies, and I really saw three macro trends leading to the emergence of jurisdictional approaches in the last 5 years or so. The first of these is that a number of stakeholders have recognized that governments in the forest countries themselves are both necessary for success of reducing deforestation and improving sustainability, but also, and importantly, insufficient for achieving that. So you both need the governments, but governments alone can't do it. This trend has really led to an expansion of climate cooperation, not just in the forest space, but also across adaptation, clean energy, all of the work on climate elements throughout the developing world. Climate cooperation has expanded to include stakeholders such as business, investment banks, NGOs, quite broadly. You can see that from some of the side events in Paris and the UNFCCC meetings, but this is, I think, a trend that we would all recognize, and it has been as true with forests as elsewhere. The second major trend has been what has been called an eidification of climate finance. And what I mean by that is that I think in some of the original conceptions of climate finance 10, 15 years ago in the UNFCCC, there was really a sense that the wealthy countries who have driven some of the emissions historically have a responsibility for compensating, but also for assisting developing countries to make a transition to clean energy and low emissions development. The fact that the actual funds that are being provided for north to south transfers have come primarily through aid agencies has in part led to an elevation of the economic growth objectives that have been traditional purview of those agencies. And in the forest space, what we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years is that some of the work on forests that has been pursued through climate finance has really been linked to both emissions reductions and to economic growth in place in the forest countries and in those communities. So this elevation of economic growth in the last few years has led to, I think, a trend towards thinking about agricultural intensification as well as other ways to both reduce deforestation and either increase or at least maintain agricultural output as those changes are happening. The third major trend I would identify is coming from REDD+, which has really moved towards landscape and jurisdictional scale action for a number of reasons, trying to address leakage, looking at the drivers of deforestation that are happening at more than simply the farm or the local scale, recognition that enforcement action is both needed and is the purview of governments, and therefore government involvement is necessary, recognition that human rights issues, local community rights issues are also directly linked to government law and enforcement actions by governments. And lastly, really a very clear recognition that success on REDD+ has to do as much with landscape planning as anything else. And planning has also traditionally been the purview of government. So not only have we seen really three trends that have led to the emergence of jurisdictional approaches. I would also say that there are three core strategies that are emerging, and they're very closely related. But the three strategies that have grown out of these different communities are merging together into jurisdictional approaches. The first of these is really a broad landscape scale approach, which is coming from conservation tradition, natural resource management, and recently from REDD+ as well. And some elements that are the hallmarks of landscape approaches include stakeholder engagement, engagement of many different sectors, so cross-sectoral goals, not just forests, not just agriculture, but including a broad range of sectors. A goal at the landscape level of reconciling competing objectives, so recognizing that many of the problems that we seek to solve are questions of competing objectives by different stakeholders, and a number of other elements of that landscape approach tradition. One label you will see landscape approaches falling under is integrated landscape management. In the academic literature, there's been a fair bit of discussion of the concept of integrated landscape management and what that means. And I think a number of conservation practitioners identify that as the mode of operation. So landscape approaches really are sort of one bucket. Jurisdictional approaches, I would say, are a little bit separate and a second element. They share many of the same elements of landscape approaches, but are a little bit different. And first, because they tend to match the administrative boundaries of government. So, province level, state level, county level, even the municipal level, the action and the boundaries, the scope of planning, the actual physical area on the ground where action is to take place matches the boundaries of a government. The jurisdictional approaches have become a major theme of REDD+, in part because of UNFCCC decisions about reference levels, with a number of decisions and trends looking to control leakage by requiring that reference levels and any measurement of performance take place at a national or subnational scale. They're a little different than landscape approaches because I think for something to be called a jurisdictional approach, it need not necessarily include a broad range of sectors. Some jurisdictional approaches may have only a single objective rather than working across multiple objectives. For example, a jurisdictional approach to zero deforestation only. You might not include additional objectives. We also see some gray areas. For example, if the boundaries of action don't necessarily match a government jurisdiction, a state or a county, but in fact match the boundaries of defined management areas. So in some examples we'll talk about there are management area boundaries rather than government boundaries. Lastly, the third strategy that we've seen develop over the last really 30 years is long-standing work on sustainability in corporate supply chains. So the drivers of deforestation are coming from commercial scale agriculture for soy, for palm oil, for beef, and plantations for pulp and paper, have often over the last several decades led to campaigns by NGOs to try to reduce the impact of those expansions on the natural world. We've seen that in Brazil with, for example, the soy moratorium. We've seen that in some of the roundtables seeking certifications for palm oil and soy and beef. These supply chain sustainability efforts in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years, have seen a wave of zero deforestation commitments from the corporate side, from traders and consumer-facing companies primarily, not as much the producers, leading up to up to 100 of these commitments in the end of 2014 in the New York Declaration. So this sort of corporate supply chain set of strategies is the third real source So together, these are merging and coming together in jurisdictional approaches to zero deforestation commitments right now. And I think this sense that each of these three approaches by themselves can get part of the way there, but together that they could be stronger is really part of what's driving this change. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these different elements are coming from different strategies. I would identify a couple primary markers of what I would call an archetype, the sort of standard, or the prime example of a jurisdictional approach to zero deforestation would have a few elements in common. First of all, the objectives and goals would be wall-to-wall, meaning they would be covering the entire jurisdiction. You wouldn't have exclusion areas where the goals or the performance measurements are not taking place. Second, the geography of the program would be specifically relevant to policy making. So that might include such things as regionally defined objectives, that geography stretches to not just where the action takes place, but also how the goals and objectives are defined. It might also stretch into how you monitor progress at the same boundaries. Another element that's common is multi-stakeholder participation. The act of bringing sectoral, bringing participants together across government, across the private sector, across banking, across NGOs, local communities, and the broad suite of stakeholders in land in a place. This is a key element. It comes from the tradition of landscape approaches, and I think it is a hallmark of jurisdictional approaches as well. If we're going to call it a jurisdictional approach to zero deforestation commitments, we might hope to see a zero deforestation goal of that as well. And lastly, many of them, not all, but many have also looked towards preferential sourcing. So the idea that a company would stand out and say that they will buy from jurisdictions that either have a program in place or are successful at the jurisdictional scale in their purchasing would be a last element. So a little terminology, just to make sure that we are clear in not just what we're talking about today, but as you move forward and think about these approaches, what you mean when you say and what other people are meaning when they say. We've already talked about landscape approaches and integrated landscape management. We've talked about jurisdictional approaches broadly as a group, but there are a few specific flavors that I want to call out. First of all, jurisdictional approaches to what? I think there's a need to be specific in what type of jurisdictional approach we're talking about. Common ones that I think we will talk about are jurisdictional approaches to addressing supply chain deforestation. You might think about jurisdictional approaches to addressing deforestation broadly, not just the deforestation caused by commodity expansion. Some of the examples we'll talk about don't have a zero deforestation goal necessarily, so you might call those a jurisdictional approach to supply chain sustainability. And then there's a ... here because that sort of need to be specific about jurisdictional approach to what I think stretches to a lot of different examples. Another dimension that I think a little clarity is helpful on is what you are including. So a jurisdictional sourcing approach, so you are going to buy from a particular place, might include a couple different flavors. So preferential sourcing we talked about. Jurisdictional sourcing commitments might go further than simply a preferential sourcing commitment. So rather than just saying that I will buy from a place with a jurisdictional approach if I can, you might commit to only buying from jurisdictions that meet certain criteria and are certified. So those might be two very different things. And lastly, jurisdictional certification, I think, is something that we're seeing a little bit of discussion about, where you might stamp a seal of approval on an entire jurisdiction and all of the products coming from that jurisdiction. So rather than looking at the farm level to ask whether a particular farm or a particular ranch has deforestation in its recent history and therefore can meet a zero deforestation commitment, you might just ask whether all of a jurisdiction is meeting some criteria and therefore all of the products coming from that jurisdiction are certified to meeting a zero deforestation commitment. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the strategies that are coming together for jurisdictional approaches, and we also talked about some of the evolution and some of the underlying trends that have led us here. But there are particular stakeholders that are looking to jurisdictional approaches for specific reasons, and these really came out in some of the interviews that I did, is that different stakeholders have different reasons for looking to jurisdictional approaches to zero deforestation commitments. One of the striking things about the interviews was that both the business and industry representatives, as well as the representatives that have a more Red Plus tradition, really saw the jurisdictional approaches as evolving out of Red Plus in a lot of ways, and in fact, a lot of the energy for jurisdictional approaches has been coming from Red Plus, in the sense that there is an unfulfilled promise for Red Plus payments, and the goals of Red Plus, the sort of capacity building and work that we've done to prepare MRV has felt a little bit like it's at a standstill without the promise of actual performance payments. So Red Plus proponents have been looking for additional financing incentives and have seen corporate supply chains, corporate purchasing as potential additional incentives, and therefore have really been excited, I think, about jurisdictional approaches and supply chain approaches, and the opportunity for these two things, these commodity supply chain sustainability approaches and Red Plus, to come together in a common set of incentives. For sustainability professionals, there have been a number of other reasons to look to jurisdictional approaches. One is a sense that certification is just not going to work. It's not spreading as quickly in places where it's being tried as it needs to. It's just not scaling to the extent that we need to solve the deforestation problem. The other sense, another sort of flavor, is that some companies feel like even if they're successful paying attention to deforestation in their supply chain and eliminating deforestation from their own supply chain, their overall objectives, maintaining the health of the planet, reducing climate change emissions, will ultimately fail because no single company, no single buyer has enough impact to really change the course of development. So the second quote here, if we only pay attention to our own supply chain, we'll end up with islands of green and a sea of destruction, really was representing this view that a single company's goals by themselves will not achieve the overall objectives. Then the next thing I would say is that amongst companies, there has been a tradition to try to solve these problems themselves, and I think the certification approaches have developed in that vein, where companies try to simply use the power of the markets and work with stakeholders on the ground, as well as third-party certification schemes, to make sure that what they're buying and selling meets the standards that they want for their company. I think in the last few years there has been a recognition amongst the companies that this problem is bigger than they can solve by themselves, and specifically that they need governments. So the demand to include governments in these efforts is now coming not just from the NGOs, but also from the private sector as well. A bit more quietly, and behind the scenes, because that's the way they're comfortable operating, but it is definitely there. They are seeing the need for governments to get engaged. And the last thing I would point out from the companies is that there's a sense that not only is certification going to fail in the macro goals because it's not going to scale appropriately, but also that it's quite expensive. And a few of the company stakeholders really had a sense that jurisdictional certifications might be a much more efficient way to help ensure the sustainability of their products. Next slide, please. So some of the reasons that stakeholders are looking to jurisdictional approaches really are related to the benefits of jurisdictional approaches. There are also some challenges, and I think the interviews brought forward a number of those challenges as well. First were a number of different types of misalignments. Physical misalignments, for example, between the administrative boundaries of a government and the actual supply shed for a particular product. So a palm oil processing mill might be drawing in fresh fruit bunches from several neighboring jurisdictions, or a soy terminal may not just be pulling soy from one place. So these misalignments have led to some challenges in terms of addressing deforestation at the jurisdictional scale. There are temporal misalignments. Government decision-making is quite slow. Corporate decision-making can be rapid. And another temporal misalignment is between rapid observation of deforestation. We have satellites and alerts that can identify deforestation on the scale of days to weeks or months. However, corporate contracts, long-term contracts for delivery of goods, as well as capital investments in developing the capacity for commercial agriculture, are both much longer term processes. So this mismatch between the ability to observe deforestation quickly, measure performance quickly, but the inability to shift capital quickly in the corporate supply chains has been a challenge, I think. There are institutional misalignments, for example, between environment and REDD+ ministries and agriculture ministries. There are incentives that are misaligned. There's some concern that governments might capture the benefits if we pursue REDD+ or certifications at the jurisdictional scale rather than passing those benefits on to the farmers themselves. There's also a concern that jurisdictional scale certification or jurisdictional scale MRV might lead companies to just flee areas that are having trouble, run away, move elsewhere, when in fact what's really needed is potentially greater investment in fixing the problems in a place. So the incentive to stay versus go has been a bit of a concern and challenge as well. Another challenge represented by the second bullet point here, the risk of lowering the bar. And the quote here, all the other goodies you get with certification may get ignored at the jurisdictional scale. This was coming from a stakeholder who has worked on certifications for a long time from the human rights perspective. So if you are monitoring deforestation at the jurisdictional scale with a satellite, you cannot see whether a company is using child or slave labor, for example. So the certification approaches that get down to the farm can address a wider range of issues potentially than might be addressed at the jurisdictional scale. There was some concern that jurisdictional sourcing in this next bullet might just be a fad. And it's unproven, it's untested, and at least, I love this quote, at least certification is the devil we know. So it might have some problems, but jumping to something new may not be the right solution. And lastly, and related, was the sense that jurisdictional approaches make a lot of sense intellectually, but in fact we are adding complexity. By bringing in REDD+, by bringing in payments, by bringing in MRV, as well as trying to bring in certification approaches and commodity supply chain sustainability, we've taken 2 or 3 nearly impossible and difficult tasks and tried to make them easier by doing them all at once. And this was an objection that I heard from 2 or 3 people as well. So I'd like to talk about a few examples of specific jurisdictional approaches that fall into this range. And I used a Venn diagram here for specific purposes, which is to represent the fact that certain specific examples may have more of a flavor of one or the other of the strategies. Please click to the next point. So the first example to talk about is the Marks and Spencer and Unilever announcement in Paris that they would preferentially source from jurisdictions. I'll read the quote here. They would prioritize our commodity sourcing from areas that have designed and are implementing jurisdictional forest and climate initiatives. So this announcement was a global announcement. It was at the Conference of the Parties in Paris, a very broad, publicly released statement. They went a little farther to list criteria for jurisdictions to qualify for their preferential sourcing. And those criteria were very closely aligned with the requirements for jurisdictional REDD+ under the UNFCCC, not surprisingly given the venue for that announcement, but also included an additional objective or strategy for reducing forest emissions while increasing agricultural productivity. So an additional goal on top of emissions reduction and deforestation reduction was inherent in the statement. That example of a jurisdictional approach has criteria that are at least initially more process-based than performance-based. There was no announcement that they would preferentially source from jurisdictions who are reducing deforestation, but rather that there would be a preferential sourcing from jurisdictions that are pursuing REDD+ programs and jurisdictional approaches. There was also part of the statement was that these preferential sourcing commitments were in addition to and supportive of their other commitments to net zero deforestation. So this clarity that it was layered on top, I think, suggests that companies may pursue a multi-level approach, so potentially implementing zero deforestation commitments down to the farm level, while at the same time trying to send a signal to the governments and jurisdictions that there would be some reward for progress at that scale as well. So this example has elements of, I think, all 3 of these. It's very closely linked to jurisdictional approaches to REDD+. It's linked closely to landscape approaches, given the multi-stakeholder approach that they've taken. And it's also has zero deforestation goals at the heart of the objective. So I place that in the center of this Venn diagram as something of a comprehensive vision at the, very much at the center of all 3 of these. Next. The next example that I think is perhaps even a better archetype of jurisdictional approaches is the Earth Innovation Institute's Territorial Performance System, and in particular the implementation of that model in Mato Grosso, Brazil. The Territorial Performance System is based on an argument that a number of the large number of proliferating strategies to reducing deforestation would be more effective if linked together through a single integrated performance-based incentive system rather than multiple different objectives. And that in particular, a shared measure, a shared metric of jurisdictional performance would be beneficial in a lot of contexts. So the Earth Innovation Institute has been working in a number of contexts, Colombia, Indonesia, and Brazil in particular, to advance this territorial performance system in a few jurisdictions. The example in Mato Grosso culminated, well, it's not a culmination, but a waypoint in that strategy was in Paris when Mato Grosso announced its produce, conserve, and include strategy, which was a strategy for the entire jurisdiction to produce more commodities, to conserve its forests, and to include farmers, indigenous peoples, local communities, and other stakeholders in a shared prosperity in the region. So this produce, conserve, and include strategy is really quite a good example of a jurisdictional approach. One thing I would point out, though, is that I think one of its core strengths, which was that the actual objectives for the produce, conserve, and include strategy were the product of a multi-stakeholder process. The farmers, the communities, the NGOs got together to decide what the objectives were together. That same strength means that the ultimate pathway that they've set out for themselves in terms of forest cover loss, is not in fact a zero deforestation commitment. So this example is more of a jurisdictional approach, a landscape approach, and an approach to supply chain sustainability, but it is not a zero deforestation approach, at least in the early years, because there will be continued forest loss, at least through 2019 or 2020 in this objective. Next. Another example is that a number of people pointed to, and several interviewees identified as one of the most advanced jurisdictional approach, is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil's work to reach a jurisdictional certification scheme, and a few pilot locations where they're trying that. In particular, in Sabah in Malaysia, the RSPO has been working with the local government to try to certify all of the palm oil from Sabah as meeting RSPO standards. And they've also begun working with jurisdictional governments and stakeholders in Central Kalimantan and in South Sumatra in a few specific districts to explore similar jurisdictional-wide certification. This is much more of a jurisdictional approach. I have it over on the left rather than as a landscape approach because it is specific to only one sector, to palm oil. It is also not a zero deforestation commitment. So it's a little a little down on the left. So this example falls a little bit more in a jurisdictional approach rather than a jurisdictional approach to zero, and it's missing some of the hallmark flavors of other jurisdictional approaches that we see from the landscape approach tradition. Next. The last example, just to touch on briefly, in Ghana. Also, it's known as Ghana's Cocoa Forest Red Plus program, or the Cocoa Forest Mosaic Landscape program, is a program that is being advanced in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facilities Carbon Fund, with funding from the Carbon Fund, I should say. And the program in Ghana here is without a doubt a landscape approach. There is no zero deforestation commitment. It is linked to supply chains, which is why it's on here at all. But it also doesn't align specifically with a government jurisdiction. So a lot of the examples that you'll hear people talk about in the community when we talk about jurisdictional approaches are falling in one or another of these directions, that they're not right smack in the center with all of the hallmarks, but rather are coming from a little bit more one of the traditions or another. Next slide, please. In the paper itself, in case folks are interested, I want to point out that there are a number of tables that talk about some of the most relevant initiatives. So broadly, the sort of archetypal initiatives that specific organizations are pursuing, such as EII's Territorial Performance System. Next. There's also a table with a number of active geographies, so example geographies of jurisdictions that are pursuing these approaches. Next. And lastly, there's a table of the organizations that are really at the head of the game in terms of advancing jurisdictional approaches on the ground. And I'd refer you to the paper for those tables, and the link will be in material that we circulate in a moment. So a few conclusions, just to bring this to a close. I would say that the conversation about jurisdictional approaches is still in early days. We're about 2 years in, which for the evolution of something like RED Plus, we've been working on for 10, 15 years, I think. So 2 years is not a whole long time in the policy development space. There's an awful lot of energy in a lot of different directions and an awful lot of creativity in trying to figure out how these multiple strategies can come together productively. But it is early. Second, there are an awful lot of very different approaches happening on the ground, and the fact that these are tailored to the specific geographies is I think, not a weakness, it's actually a strength. So we do need different solutions in different places, and the jurisdictional approaches that I was hearing about in this research are really tailor-made to the places where they are taking place. Next, we've seen that the most important and promising element, and this was a theme that really pervaded the conversations I had, was it was very promising that these approaches presented the opportunity to drive dialogue, and not just dialogue, but also a convergence of goals and objectives across multiple stakeholders. So the opportunity to bring business, government, community all together to decide what are our goals in this place and how are we going to get there was really the most exciting element of jurisdictional approaches. And lastly, on a note of caution, one of the conclusions is that there is a strategic challenge, and I think something we need to keep our eye on, is that one of the hallmarks of what makes them successful, which is bottom-up dialogue and stakeholder participation, conflicts a little bit with who gets to decide what the objectives are. So when we're looking at a zero deforestation commitment at the global scale, that's a very top-down definition of success. If a bottom-up stakeholder process defines success differently, we might have a little bit of a mismatch, and I think that is a challenge that we need to solve going forward. Finally, I just want to really hammer home that while there are cautions, while there are challenges, our conversations and research suggest strongly that jurisdictional approaches are likely to have an increasingly important role in delivering sustainable landscapes with reduced or zero forest loss. And in that sense, they're really quite exciting. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I have had a few participants send in questions for our Q&A portion, but if you have questions that you would like Michael or Lloyd to answer, please, by all means, take this time to send them in. I'm going to start off with a question from Michael, which is, what are the top priorities for the next year to make sure that these jurisdictional approaches move forward successfully?
Thank you. I think there are four. Which indicates that I knew this question was coming. But I think innovation and experimentation are really the top priority. We need to be trying this out in as many places as we can, seeing what works and what doesn't work. Second, we need some platforms, some dynamic and transparent platforms for sharing the progress, sharing the challenges, and sharing the lessons that we've learned from the innovative and experimental attempts to do this. Third, I think we just need more examples of bringing stakeholders together in place. So this stakeholder process, this bottom-up stakeholder process in a jurisdiction, setting the objectives that seems so promising about the approach, is something that has happened a few times at different scales, but we really need more examples of those to learn from them. And lastly, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is that certification approaches at the farm scale don't necessarily achieve scale, but nobody's quite sure how to scale up to certifying or approving products from an entire jurisdiction. So I think we need some innovation specifically in this question of scaling certification approaches to the jurisdictional scale. Those would be some of my priorities.
Great, thank you. Sort of along those lines, can you speak a little bit more about how the private sector is involved in these jurisdictional approaches? Are they really just involved in the purchasing end, or are there companies, like Unilever and Marks and Spencer, that are getting more involved in the planning stages of these kinds of approaches?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a mix. We would have to be a little careful in pointing to 2 or 3 companies who are deeply engaged and concluding that the private sector as a whole is engaged. I think there's no doubt, and really, if you look at the private sector broadly, we have to conclude that they are not going to spend a huge amount of their time and money to advance these systems broadly. Having said that, there are a few leading organizations like Unilever and Marks and Spencer who happen to be the co-chairs for the Consumer Goods Forum Sustainability Council who are investing some significant amount of time in the effort. For those leading companies who see sustainability as either a core competency or as a competitive advantage and who are investing time and energy in it, they are making some progress. They are attending meetings. They're not just attending; they're funding some meetings. They are using their weight in multi-stakeholder platforms and business platforms, particularly like the Consumer Goods Forum, to try to bring other companies along. So I think there is a fair bit of engagement. The Unilever and Marks and Spencer example, that commitment, the jurisdictional, the preferential sourcing commitment from them, is moving ahead. I wouldn't say rapidly, but it is moving ahead. There's been a working group for the last year or so looking to define some standards. So trying to say how do we decide whether a jurisdiction meets a minimum criteria to be sourced from preferentially. And they've got a website. There's some up-to-date information. They've recognized 2 global standards for jurisdictional programs. Specifically, if a jurisdiction is pursuing those, then it is eligible. So they are making some progress, and those 2 companies have been engaged the whole way.
That's great. You mentioned a few of the barriers in terms of, resource allocation, but are there any other key barriers that you notice private sector actors coming up against as they look into these jurisdictional sourcing approaches? Or is that that's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis?
Well, no, I think again, in terms of language, for jurisdictional sourcing approaches or jurisdictional certification, I think there are a number of specific barriers. I think the companies don't have the reach necessarily or the ears on the ground to know where to look. At least this is what I was hearing from them. They are aware of and have been part of examples in Mato Grosso or in in specific places, Pará, Brazil, and Sabah, Malaysia, Central Kalimantan. But that's just 4 places on Earth, and they source from dozens, if not hundreds, for their commodities, and they have seen a barrier in terms of identifying specific jurisdictions where the governments and the civil society have a shared common interest in sustainability and therefore present the opportunity to engage. So I think that's one barrier. I also think it's been harder than they expected. The number of zero deforestation commitments that we saw in 2014 with very aggressive timelines that they would be meeting a zero deforestation commitment within a year, within 2 years, by 2018, by 2017. Those dates are coming quickly, and they are, I don't think, anywhere near ready to actually ensure zero deforestation. So I think it has been harder than they expected as well. So I would list that as a pretty big challenge.
Sort of shifting gears a little bit, I did have someone ask if there are any organic practices that are linked to these ZDCs. You mentioned, there's one criticism that it's harder to get down to some of those more human rights issues on the ground. Are there other components that might be included in other approaches that maybe don't get included in these jurisdictional approaches, like organic certification?
I didn't come across organic certification as an element to any of the jurisdictional approaches. That doesn't mean they're not out there, but I'm not familiar with them. I think the broader point I was trying to make is that when we step up in scale from a process that examines the practices of individual farms to a process that looks broadly at the success or failure of an entire geographic area, we may face the risk of losing out on the ability to assess whether production is achieving other objectives. So I think certainly human rights and child and slave labor are one example, but organic might be another one. You can't look at a satellite and decide whether production from a farm is organic or not. You have to actually go to that farm.
Great, thanks. I have a participant who asked why governments in forest countries participate and invest in these jurisdictional approaches. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific benefits or incentives for governments?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of them. And I think the thing we're seeing is that the community is trying to increase both the number and the extent of those incentives. But there's a wide range. We have seen incentives flow from REDD+, so actual payments have flowed to Brazil. We have seen a number of leaders in forest countries who have, from a very ground-up grassroots type of movement, seen some of the destruction that forest conversion has wrought on their communities and people. So while there is economic development opportunity in forest conversion, there is also a fair bit of social upheaval and damage to the environment. And I think there are leaders who have seen that and sought to change that in the forest countries and in these jurisdictions. Some leaders have seen an opportunity to provide the types of commodities and development that companies want and will want more in the future. So the types of zero deforestation commitments that we've seen out of the companies really do point to where the future of global trade may be headed, and leaders who want to be part of that, I think, to see some broad incentives to move in that direction. We also see domestic incentives in many places through processes like the UNFCCC and through the commitments that countries have made to reduce their emissions. The NDCs and INDCs have in fact provided more and more incentives for not just national leaders but also subnational leaders to achieve that emissions and development transition to meet those commitments. So I think there are a broad range of incentives for the leaders in place. It doesn't hurt to bring them and to have the opportunity to be seen as a global leader. So going to the UNFCCC conferences, showing up in Davos, and being an example for the world, I think can be an incentive for individual leaders. It obviously is not an incentive that will stand the test of time, but at least in this initial phase, one of the things that can provide an incentive is that opportunity to show the way, and that has, I think, had a positive impact on a number of leaders specifically. Thank you.
I have someone who asked about natural resource management governance issues, complexities, and whether or not you've observed those promoting or inhibiting the potential delivery of these zero deforestation goals. Was that a subject that you came across while you were doing your analysis and research?
I'm not exactly sure I'm clear on the question. I think natural resource management broadly is a practice of addressing competing objectives, and I think there is both a reality and perhaps an overemphasis on the conflict that producing more means conserving less. There is both some truth and some lie in that statement. So you can manage your natural resources in a way that provides greater economic activity and greater output up to a certain point. And at the same time, you can manage your natural resources to clear them and convert forests to farms, and your output will be significantly greater, at least for a while. So there are tensions, and I think on the forest government side, that tension is first and foremost. At least it is felt. And part of the challenge has been both identifying ways to increase productivity while maintaining forest cover, but also really trying to I think, change the overall perception of natural resource management that a more corporate commodity-based development pathway has created, that there is a zero-sum game. Lloyd, Lloyd might have something to add to that.
Yeah, Lloyd, feel free to weigh in if you would like.
I think, Emily, nothing to add really at this moment, since we're kind of approaching the end of the hour.
That's true. So, Michael, I'm going to give you one last question, and it's sort of a different subject, and then we'll probably wrap up. But can you expand on what you see as both the likeliest and most promising ways to increase innovative financing for these zero deforestation jurisdictional approaches and piloting?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about the ISFL, the Biocarbon Fund's Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscape, that is trying to provide some innovative financing mechanisms and really identify ways to channel money to agricultural producers in places where deforestation reduction is a shared priority. I think that's a pretty innovative and interesting example. I think I worry a little bit about a tendency to look to companies for a lot of the innovative finance. I think the idea that the companies will put forward a huge amount of cash up front to change the world into what they need to provide zero deforestation goods is probably not going to happen. On the other hand, I think some of the work on banking and finance industry representatives to try to make sure that access to finance for agricultural development is linked to planning and sustainability of the producers that are gaining access to that finance. I think that's a pretty exciting link that also needs additional exploration.
Great, thank you. I have one last question for Lloyd here. Can you give some examples, maybe just briefly, of what WWF is currently doing on the ground in forest geographies to test or advance some of these approaches?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks again, Michael, for your work on this and doing the webinar with us today. As most will know, WWF works in a lot of countries around the world, so maybe I'll just use this chance to cite a couple of examples of our work in this space. We've been a major player in a regional palm oil initiative in West and Central Africa, aiming to achieve implementation of national policy frameworks around responsible palm oil production. In Colombia, WWF expects to be an important partner in a developing program in the Orinoco River watershed under the ISFL that Mike was mentioning. This program will seek to achieve basically large-scale land use planning and sustainable production in several food commodities while minimizing forest loss and quantifying these results in terms of climate results and emission reductions. We're involved in the Malaysia, the Sabah Jurisdictional Palm Oil Initiative, and of course also supporting the design and implementation of several jurisdictional RED programs in places like East Kalimantan, Indonesia, Mayendombe, DRC, and trying to bring private sector partners to the table in the design and implementation of these programs. I think looking forward, I expect we'll try to show more leadership in this space, for example, by extracting and disseminating lessons learned in various pilots, sort of like we've done with this work with Mike, building familiarity with these approaches in the private sector as a potential avenue for meeting their sustainability commitments. I think something that's going to be really important is bringing Southern voices, government, civil society representatives, and others more front and center in this conversation and establishing specific linkages with national efforts to achieve climate targets and NDCs. And of course, as WWF would often do, is continuing to bring a critical view on the environmental credibility, social, and climate integrity in these approaches. So maybe I should wrap up there, Emlyn, since we're, I think, just about out of time.
Just about. Thank you, Lloyd. Yeah, we have come to the end of our time today. Next slide, please. And I really want to thank Michael and you, Lloyd, for sharing your expertise with our community, and to thank the participants for joining us and sending in your thoughtful and engaging questions. We weren't able to get to everyone's questions, so I'll follow up with Lloyd and Michael and see if we can get some written responses to some of these as well, because we really had a broad variety of inquiries that I think are all worthy of being addressed. You'll also receive a follow-up email in a few hours with some additional resources that are specific to this webinar. Next slide, please. If you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel in about a day or so, and you can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.